I'm Sunita Sarabji, co-director with Pilar Marrero of these Friday news briefings. This year is a very consequential year around the globe. 4 billion people in 50 countries will vote. The New York Times calls this one of the largest and most consequential democratic exercises in living memory, affecting how the world will be run for decades to come. Speakers today will look at how the US diaspora engages with elections in their home countries, and we will focus on 3 countries with huge geopolitical ramifications for the US: Mexico, Taiwan, and India. We will also focus on the impact of misinformation and disinformation spread via social media and their impacts on election outcomes. Our distinguished speakers today include Kathleen Newland, Senior Fellow and Co-founder of the Migration Policy Institute; Dr. Arvind Panagariya, Professor of Indian Political Economy at Columbia University; Rong Xiaoqing, who many of you know. She's a veteran reporter with Tao Daily in New York; Dr. Diana Alarcón González. She's a specialist on Mexico, former chief advisor and international affairs coordinator for Mayor Claudia Sheinbaum of Mexico City; and Dr. Rohit Chopra, professor in the Department of Communication in the College of Arts and Sciences at Santa Clara University. We ask speakers to speak slowly for our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean. And we ask reporters to enter their questions in the chat, which we will address in the last 15 minutes of today's briefing. Our speakers are also encouraged to answer questions in the chat throughout the conference. We will send a video of today's briefing and expanded bios with contact information for each speaker to all participants later on today. So now we begin with Kathleen Newland, who will provide an overview of the elections and what may be at stake for the diaspora. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you, Sunita. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to kick off this briefing with some general remarks about diaspora participation in country of origin elections, and particularly relating to voting for citizens resident abroad. The right to vote is one of the main demands of diaspora populations, as you know, who want to remain active members of their country of origin polity and want to have a say in what happens there. In 1980, only 21 countries enfranchised citizens abroad. By 2020, 141 countries allowed citizens abroad to vote under various conditions, and a few others have been added since then. That's nearly 3/4 of the countries in the world. The practices in diaspora voting are across a wide spectrum. Of course, about 1/4 of the countries in the world don't allow it at all. And in others, it's available, but hard to access. For example, voters are required physically to return to the country of origin in order to vote. And in fact, that's the case in the 3 countries that we're going to be talking about in more detail today. A second, or I should say a third group of countries may have policies for non-resident citizens to vote, but those policies really aren't implemented at all, or they're implemented very selectively. In another group of countries, overseas voting is available, but it's very hands-off. I'd put the US in that category. People sort of have to find out for themselves how to register. They have to go through the procedures with without a lot of outreach to diaspora communities. And then there are those that make overseas voting pretty easy, that allow people to vote electronically or at consulates and embassies, a little more difficult if people live some distance away from those facilities, but certainly easier than having to go home in person. In a much smaller group of countries, overseas participation is actively encouraged and facilitated, sometimes by the government itself, sometimes by political parties. So you've seen active courtship of the diaspora by political parties from many countries that allow overseas voting, particularly those that make it pretty easy. And the leadership from of political parties from Taiwan, India, and Mexico have all campaigned in the United States within the past 6 months. So there's quite a wide spectrum here of how countries engage with their diasporas when it comes to voting. There's and we might ask, how much difference does diaspora voting make? And here again, there's a big spectrum. In small countries with large diasporas, like, for example, El Salvador or Moldova, both of those countries have 25% of their population living abroad, and both make it easy to vote, indeed court the potential voters. But there is some concern in some countries, including those, that non-citizen voters may have too much influence, that they can make a decision but don't have to live with the consequences. Of course, there are ways other than voting that diasporas participate in elections. Some are very active in fundraising for particular candidates. Others are active in organizing, for example, phone banks back to the country of origin, where people try to persuade their friends and family to vote for a particular candidate. But the votes themselves are, of course, can be important in particularly in close elections, as some people are expecting in Taiwan. So there is quite a bit of controversy about how actively overseas voters should be encouraged to participate and how. And one of the things that always surprises me a little bit is how few eligible voters in many countries who are eligible voters who are living abroad actually do vote. Some of you may think back to sort of 2011, and in the aftermath of the Iraq War, there was a huge international effort made to find Iraqis who were of voting age, to register them, to set up voting stations, and so on. A really enormous effort. And in the end, only about a quarter of those eligible did turn out to vote. And it's not uncommon that people passionately want the right to vote, but then don't always exercise it. Of course, that's not unique to diaspora populations. That's true of many voters in many countries. So let me turn just very briefly, because we have experts who are going to talk about these three countries particularly. As I mentioned, India, Taiwan, and Mexico all require that voters go home, go to the country of origin in person to exercise their right to vote. It's not always so easy to find out how to register and to be registered, but the actual number of overseas votes is not likely to make a huge difference, especially in India, where Prime Minister Modi is leading by a 60-point margin in recent polls. In Mexico, the incumbent President Lopez Obrador has a 30% popularity rating. So a closer election, a margin of voters could make a difference. But it's significant that for example, of the 700,000 Taiwanese born people who live in the United States, only 4,000 have registered to vote in the 2024 election. Despite that, all the main presidential candidates have campaigned in the US in the last 6 months. So obviously diasporas have an influence, though it may not be in the actual number of votes. Let me turn it back over to you, Sunita, and I look forward to hearing from our speakers.
Kathleen, thank you so much for your introductory remarks, which really set the tone for this briefing. We move on to Dr. Chopra, who will discuss the impact of disinformation and misinformation spread through social media, and maybe focus a little bit on AI as it emerges. Thank you. Welcome, Dr. Chopra.
All right, thank you very much. And I'm going to try and avoid the occupational hazard of getting too much into detail or being too pedantic or going over time. So I'll just timer here. Well, thank you very much for this kind invitation, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So I want to start being an academic, and I will not be too pedantic, by just mentioning a couple of things to get some historical perspective, which is that fake news and misinformation are not a new phenomenon. In fact, historically, they are very closely intertwined with the history of news itself. And it is only by around the middle of the 19th century, once you have the Associated Press developing a wire service that publications across the political spectrum can use, that you start getting this idea of objective journalism, which I know is a kind of problematic term in itself too. Benjamin Franklin is guilty of fake news. He spread a rumor about Native Americans in the service of King George scalping Americans or anti-colonial Americans. William Randolph Hearst spread fake news, which actually was an incident that led to the US-Spanish War. So we've been here before, and there have been solutions. So history, if history is any guide, we should have some optimism. Now, what I want to mention with regard to sort of fake news is two or three different things, which is that fake news in the context of elections or otherwise winds up doing two different things. One is that there is always a particular claim, right, which is inserted into public discourse, public conversation as it is. Simultaneously, every such incident of fake news muddies the waters with regard to the difference between what is fake and what is true. So in a sense, as a professor, it is like the Wikipedia problem, which is that 80% of the stuff on Wikipedia is accurate, very accurate. 20% is false, but we don't know what that 20% is. And therefore, I cannot tell my students to use Wikipedia as a resource for research. Where does the diaspora come into all of this? Now, in the case of the Indian diaspora, even if you hold what is called an OCI, an Overseas Citizen of India card, it's technically not something that allows you to vote. If you are an Indian citizen, you have to go back and vote, as we heard. But given that fake news has been, and misinformation has been very closely tied to the role of social media, and now increasingly, the worry is that it will be used AI tools will be sort of weaponized to spread fake news. These companies that are based in the US, particularly US centered, they're global companies, but they're all US centered. The dynamics that take place in the US and impact the diaspora have these kind of trigger effects. So even though there is a kind of autonomous logic of politics on the ground in the home countries, whether it's Mexico, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's India, the diaspora becomes a really important kind of conduit. And this happens in a couple of ways. One is that as it is, because information is circulating in a global space, these movements, these fake news trends, they borrow themes from one another. Now here I just want to pause for a second and mention two other factors that have gone hand in hand with the rise of fake news globally. One is a kind of erosion of democracy worldwide, the rise of authoritarianism, right? And a kind of centralization of authority and power. Another factor has been a general crisis in media, which predates really the rise of social media, but is accentuated by social media. I mean, even by, mid-2015, state of journalism was in a kind of crisis. And then when you think back upon, the US media coverage in 2003 about the war in Iraq, that didn't do much for its kind of legitimacy. Now, what winds up happening is you get a global kind of discourse. You have these themes like the deep state, the influence of Soros, and so on, COVID conspiracies, all circulating in this international space, and all these movements kind of cross-fertilize each other. Then these movements are kind of, these themes, they enter sort of local discourse, right? And they are used to kind of muddy the water further. In the case of India, for instance, the theme of India being a strong state and Mr. Modi being a strong leader has been a master trope that has very effectively been combined with particular criticisms of opposition leaders and dissenters. And a lot of that, those strategies have come from the Indian diaspora as such. And I know that similar things have been seen in the case of Brazil, and now similar things are being seen in the case of Argentina. AI is poised to be a threat, and Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, actually mentioned this recently, saying that there were 16 significant incidents of AI being used last year, which had complicated political consequences. Where AI will come in is that it will allow this kind of bias and fake news to be generated in real time, algorithmically. And the use of sophisticated deep fakes, again, in the Indian context, we already see it happening with, for instance, these fantastic images being built of a certain kind of imagined Hindu past. So AI is already being used. But as we get closer to the elections, I think we are going to see concrete claims, right, combined with these kind of very sophisticated videos. And this is going to be a sophisticated AI equivalent of the kinds of rumors that have been circulating on WhatsApp for years, anyways, which have even led to the deaths of minorities or, mobs lynching people on grounds of being child abductors and so on. So I have a little less than a minute, and I just want to mention that, sorry, pardon me, I've got a bit of a cold. I know that in Brazil, there has been an initiative to sort of challenge fake news and to criminalize fake news, and the big tech companies have pushed back upon it, against it. And that's a laudable initiative. But there have also been some, serious concerns expressed by journalists about this kind of concentration of power. So we will need, I think, to sort of rethink and reimagine the relationship between three entities: the state, the tech companies, and stakeholders or the public globally. And we will need to really think about how much political power different entities, such as the diaspora, have, right, with regard to determining the outcomes of politics, including but not limited to elections in different countries on the ground. And I'll leave it at that and be happy to go into more depth in the question answer session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chopra. And reporters, please do enter your questions in the chat for all speakers. We will take them during the last 15 minutes of today's briefing. A little bit different format today because we have 5 speakers. We next welcome Dr. Arvind Panagariya from Colombia, who will discuss the Indian elections, the largest elections in the world. Welcome.
Thank you, Sunita.
Yes.
Let me just say that both the presentations were excellent, quite a bit to learn there. I'm going to first say a few words about the organization of the Indian elections, because this is really by far globally the largest exercise of this kind. And I'll come to some of the diaspora issues a little bit later towards the end. So just to give you some sense of what is involved in the Indian elections, there are about 900 million voters, of whom anywhere between 600 to 630 million will vote in the forthcoming election. which will begin sometime. I think the Election Commission has not announced the dates, but likely to begin sometime in April and end sometime in May. So this is an exercise which will last for somewhere between 4 to 5 weeks. There are about 11 million election officials, including security forces, that will participate. They will have to be deployed. And the election will, if it follows the pattern that it had the last time in 2019, it will be conducted in about 6 different phases. To ensure security remains a very important issue, and elections have by and large been held very peacefully in India, and substantially because of the security arrangements that are made, and that is what also makes it more it makes it essential to spread the election over that many weeks. Election officials and security forces travel by foot, road, trains, helicopters, boats, and sometimes even on elephants. So this is an effort to involve everybody. They try to reach out. There are instances, when they put up these voting booths, even in a forest. In one case in 2009, there was only a single voter who was a kind of, who was a sannyasi, an ascetic living in a forest. And so that voting booth was really set up just for one ascetic. Elections are done electronically using VVPAT machines. Initially, there were some complaints about these. So not these machines actually also put out a printed version of the way the vote was cast. So if somebody has a dispute, they can challenge it, and it can be verified using the printed versions of the votes. India is divided into 543 constituencies. It is a parliamentary democracy, and so the voters are voting for the members of parliament. Approximately 500 political parties actually will be participating in the upcoming elections. So this is really a truly gigantic kind of exercise. As has already been noted, Prime Minister Modi will be leading his party for a 3rd term. Now, for a leader who is in his 3rd term, he still remains incredibly popular. If you think of Margaret Thatcher or almost any other leader around the world, by the time you get to the 3rd term, you are no longer popular. But he remains even globally. When the surveys have been done, last one was sometime in December, his popularity among the Indians was 76%. His nearest rival was the Mexican president, who had 66% popularity in that poll. So Prime Minister Modi really remains very popular. So even though this is a parliamentary system, and you're and as a voter, you're voting only for for a member of parliament, so you're voting for that specific individual. For the last 2 elections, 2014 and 2019, this election has become very much a presidential form of election. It's as though you're voting for Modi or voting against Modi. And there are good reasons why Modi remains so popular. On his watch, India has become 5th largest economy from 10th largest when he came first to power about 9 years ago. Currently, India is the fastest growing major economy. It's growing about 7.5%. It is expected to become the 3rd largest in 3 or 4 years. Inflation and unemployment are generally low. So Modi has also effectively implemented all the benefit schemes for the poor and needy. There was a long history for decades actually of nearly 80% of the funds spent on these schemes kind of dissipating on the way through the very leaky system. And using biometric identity, Modi has really successfully closed all those leaks, and so the benefits are actually reaching the beneficiaries. And the opposition in the current election remains quite fragmented. So, whereas in 2019, there was a substantial part of the media predicting that Modi might not get the majority and that may lead to the formation of the government by the opposition. Hardly anybody is doing that currently. Currently, there is pretty much consensus that Modi is going to be back. Now, I come to finally just a minute or two on the diaspora engagement, and Professor Chopra really covered it very, very nicely. In the Indian case, I would say that, in spite of the fact that there is a very vibrant kind of participation of Indian diaspora and the Indians themselves also on social media, its impact on Indian elections is still a bit limited. A very large part of India is rural India. While mobiles etc. have reached, still I think elections are still fought on the conventional way. That the parties have their people managing every single booth. There are about 1 million voting booths at which votes are casted, and so this is very spread out, and there is a direct outreach by the various parties. So in this sense, I think while the impact of social media and therefore diaspora also will continue to rise over time, at the present moment, I still think that this is going to have only a limited kind of impact. Nevertheless, diaspora is very engaged. There are a lot of Modi fans in the United States, and there are also a lot of Modi detractors in the United States, and both participate very, very passionately. In terms of the diaspora voting, it has been already stated, and even for the citizens of India like myself, you can't vote because you have to be there. I am finally, for the first time in life, expecting to vote because I hope to be in India at the time. So hopefully I'll be able to register and vote, but generally we are not able to vote. There are a lot of interests, diaspora interests, especially in the United States in the election, precisely because what policies are going to follow does depend on what kind of government comes in. And Modi certainly is very technology savvy himself, very tech savvy, and promotes, he promotes technology. So from the viewpoint of the tech industry and tech cooperation, which he has been promoting already, I think Eric Schmidt had taken, there is this India-US tech corridor he has started, and that sort of initiative, those sorts of initiatives will continue. Agriculture is a big issue in the United States. There, I'm afraid, whichever government comes in, whether Modi or the opposition, in the short term, at least, the policy is unlikely to change. Although Modi certainly is somebody who believes in negotiating, and therefore, if he were to give something in return, probably he will engage. And so under him, certainly there's some possibility of some opening of agricultural market in India, although only a remote one, but with a skillful negotiation, I think it can be done. So that's where most of the diaspora kind of issues are. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
I am so sorry, I'm muted. Thank you so much, Dr. Panagariya. We move on to Dr. Diana Alarcón González, who will give us a perspective on the elections in Mexico. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about Mexico in this context, in the context of the conversation we are having. And let me start by recognizing the importance of Mexican diaspora, especially in North America, especially in the United States. In the United States, we estimate over 11 million Mexicans living and working in the United States. These are first generation Mexicans. But we recently, a couple of years ago, passed a constitutional reform in the country where the children of Mexicans that were born abroad, they can be registered as Mexicans as well. So if you account for first, second, third generation of Mexicans living in other countries, we are up to 30 million, some people say 40 million of Mexicans or potential Mexicans living in other countries. And that is the importance of the participation, that is the importance of Mexican diaspora in the elections. Potentially, it can determine actually electoral results in Mexico. Unfortunately, we have a still very low participation of our citizens living in other countries, low participation in the voting system. Even though we are able to vote from abroad, and I can see there is a big difference here in relation to India. Mexicans living abroad can vote virtually, if they registered online. We can also vote by the postal office, sending our vote to Mexico, registered postal service. And we can also go to a consulate abroad and vote in person in those offices. So even though we do have a right to vote from abroad, we still have a very low participation of Mexicans living abroad. In 2018, when we had a very important election in Mexico, when President López Obrador was elected as president, we had around 90,000 votes abroad, from Mexicans abroad. Very, very low still. Right now, we have a very active campaign hoping that we will be able to increase the number of people registered to vote. Unfortunately, at this point, we are still at very low numbers. We have, even though we are able to vote from abroad, we have several restrictions to do so. And you have to register. You need to have an electoral ID first, which is a process that you start in your consulate, And once you have a card, an ID card, you have to register to vote from abroad, right? So it's a two-step process that ends, in this case, on the 20th of February. So right now, we have a very short window of opportunity for Mexicans to register to vote from abroad. And you can see how there is a preoccupation, a very large preoccupation, to increase the number of people who are able to express their political preferences, even though they live in another country. So that's the invitation. That's the very active campaign that we have right now, hoping that especially Mexicans living in the United States, which are the largest number in our diaspora, hoping that they will register to vote. And why this is important this year? In Mexico, 2024 is going to have a historical election process for the number of positions, of political positions that are up for voting. We are going to renovate very close to 20,000 political positions that are going to be up for election, including the presidency. So it's not only the number of positions that we are going to be electing this year, but it's also the moment that the political moment that we are living in Mexico. As you know, in 2018, we elected a government that was coming from the opposition, that was coming from a political coalition completely different to the one that was ruling Mexico for many years. President López Obrador won the election with a very large margin, and since then he has been incorporating what he calls a fourth transportation of the political life in Mexico. Very deep changes to improve democracy, to create a government that is focused on improving the well-being of people, to eradicate corruption and privilege in Mexico, which were running very large for so many years. We have a very unequal society in Mexico, mainly because we have had governments that governments that are not governing for the people. All of these changed in 2018. We have a government now that is committed to improve people's welfare. And this is what is at stake in 2024 in Mexico. What Mexicans will have to decide is whether they want to go back to the past, to the kind of governments we had in the past, or we want to give more breathing space to this fourth transformation, to these policies that were initiated in 2018 and which need to continue if we are to eradicate privilege and corruption in Mexico. So this is the importance of the election in 2024. And the greatest challenge that we have at this point is to increase the number of people who are voting from abroad. In Mexico, at the national, within our national borders, we have something that 98 million people voting in the country. Our diaspora is important, and we need to make sure that they exercise their right to vote from abroad. So the bottom line for us at this point is, regardless of what your political preferences are, please, if you're Mexican living in another country, register to vote, because this is a historical election. And with this, I will end my introduction to Mexican electoral challenges in 2024.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alarcón. This was an excellent presentation. Our last speaker today is a familiar face, Rong Xiaoqing, a veteran reporter with Tao Daily. Rong, welcome.
Thank you, Sunita. Thanks for having me. So in the previous discussion, Taiwan was put together with India and Mexico as the three countries we are talking about today. But we have to make it clear that Taiwan officially is not a country, and whether it will become an independent country is the reason why that this presidential election is such a high stake one. And the polls indeed will open in just a few hours. And the outcome would not only affect Taiwan and China, but also the US and China and probably the whole world. There are three candidates. The leading one, Lai Ching-te, he is from the Democratic Progressive Party, or the DPP. And he is currently, all the polls have him as the leading candidate. He's ahead of the second place candidate by 3 to 10 points. But he's the least candidate that Beijing wants to see who win this presidential election. Because DPP, which is the current ruling party, has been in the office for 2 terms, 8 years already, is known, or at least in the eyes of Beijing, is a party that supports Taiwan independence, or in other words, to make Taiwan an independent country. The DPP was formed in 1986, so it's a relatively a new party compared to the old one, Kuomintang, or KMT, whose candidate now is the second place in the polls. But the DPP, of course, now, like candidates, non-candidates admit that they support Taiwan independence or they are trying to get the independence, because everyone knows an official declaration of independence means a war. Beijing will definitely interfere with military forces, and then American probably would get involved, and the whole world would probably be dragged in. So no one is saying that we want independence, but DPP in the early 1990s has put an article in its charter. So it amended its charter and saying that the party allows Taiwan voters to vote for whether Taiwan would become an independent country via referendum. So since then on, the party, some people think, or some people call it the Independence Party. But of course, the party leader later clarified, saying that we just want to allow people to choose rather than we are trying to push for independence. But anyway, so the current situation, the current pose is not working on Beijing's interest, it seems. But the candidate of DPP, Lai Ching-te, who is also the vice president, the current vice president, he used to say that he is a pragmatic worker for Taiwan independence. Of course, that's been toned down during the campaign. But the current president, which is also from the same party, he probably, you guys still remember that she was the one who called President Trump when Trump was elected, and Trump picked up the phone. And this was a big incident in diplomatic relationships, because Taiwan officially, if it's not a country, the leader of Taiwan shouldn't be directly talking to the U.S. president. So at that time, Beijing was kind of really mad and made a big fuss. And then the president also in 2022 welcomed the then Congress, U.S. Congress Speaker Nancy Pelosi to visit the island. That was a big incident too. And Beijing and China and U.S. relationship was like declining much more quickly after Nancy Pelosi's visit. And last year, both the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, and the vice president and the presidential candidates from the DPP, Lai Ching-te, visited the U.S., and which was big things for as well, international matters as well. Then how would this affect China and U.S. relationship? It really depends on what the elected president would do. It doesn't really matter what they say now. And also it depends on what the U.S. would do. Lai's election, Lai, the candidate from DPP, his election won't automatically trigger a war. But, if he pushed for independence, or if he do something provoked Beijing, it's really hard to predict what would happen. On the U.S. side, President Biden has already said that after the election, he's going to send a delegation to Taiwan to meet the president-elect. But this delegation won't be composed of the current officials, but the former members of cabinets. But still, it would be very sensitive for Beijing. We'll wait and see what Beijing would do to react as a reaction to that. How would this affect the overseas Chinese, or including Taiwan immigrants? First of all, Taiwan immigrants are really keen about this election, and they're not allowed. Taiwan doesn't allow mail-in ballots, so you have to go back as an overseas citizen. You have to go back to Taiwan to vote. Not only you have to go back to Taiwan, you have to go back to the city or the county or the village where your household registration is. So even if, like, say, if my household registration is in Taipei, but I happen to be in Tainan, another city, I can't vote. I have to go back to my hometown. There is a very interesting political calculation behind this. In the past few years, there were some efforts in trying to make a policy to allow overseas Taiwanese to vote by mail-in ballots. But the ruling party, DPP, has thwarted all those efforts. The reason being that overseas Taiwanese, a lot of them came to this country starting in the 1960s, and the DPP was formed in the 1986. So those immigrants who came to this country in the early days had more ties with the Kuomintang, the KMT, the oldest party in Taiwan, rather than the DPP. And also, overseas Taiwanese include a lot of Taiwanese businessmen and international students who are currently living in China. And these people support closer ties with Beijing rather than independence. So they're not likely to be supporters for the DPP. That's the reason that the ruling party doesn't want mail-in ballots. So I heard a lot of complaints from Taiwanese immigrants saying that, like poor people, who can't afford the airfare, or seniors who can't, like take the flight easily, are kind of like their voting rights are affected this way. But that's the case currently, but it's not only Taiwanese immigrants care about this election. I think all Chinese immigrants, no matter which countries you come from, and I think all Asian immigrants may care about it, because the major thing people worry about is if there is a war, and if the U.S. get involved. The Asian hate waves that we've seen in the recent years would definitely be perpetuated. And Chinese, especially Chinese immigrants, no matter whether you're from Taiwan or mainland China, probably would have to be put in a situation that you have to choose sides. Whether you stand with the U.S. and declare that you're loyal to the U.S., or if you support to Beijing, and your situation, your life in the U.S. would really be miserable. I want to share my screen to show you a picture that I took in August. Let me see whether it will work. Can you see the picture? You guys see the picture?
No, we do not.
Oh, then I don't know. Okay, then maybe we forget about this. I don't know how to do it.
Okay.
But that's just like in August, when Lai Ching-te, the current presidential candidate, visited the U.S. in New York. Chinese immigrants pro-Beijing and his own supporters, mostly Taiwanese immigrants, were kind of like squaring off out of the hotel where he made his speech. The tension is very high already, but after the election, we'll see what's going to happen in the Chinese American community here, and also on the international relations.
Rong, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. We will, if you send us your photo, we'll send it out as follow-up collateral. And I wanted to ask you, before we move to Q&A, you watched, as a reporter, you likely watched the Xi Biden meeting at APEC, where both clearly laid out their objectives for Taiwan. What was your immediate response after watching that meeting?
Well, I actually talked to a lot of people and asking about their opinions. So this is not necessarily my own opinions, but most of people think the friendly talk during that meeting doesn't really mean much. They don't think U.S.-China relationship will go back to the old good day, the good old days where like everyone's friendly. The competition between the two countries would not be reduced or getting less intense. So I think currently people are still embracing themselves for a very unpredictable future.
Thank you so much. We'll move to Q&A in the order questions were asked. So the first question comes from Orhan or Arkat. Orhan, please ask your question.
Thank you, Sunita. Thank you, Rong.
Yes.
It's good to hear you, and it was really good presentation. So, yeah, I was thinking from the beginning. So the people who doesn't live in their country, it does make sense they vote for their home country's government, since they don't live there. They don't feel the beauty, or they don't feel the inflation, let's say, on the bad way. So they don't live in their country. Does it make sense to vote for their home country?
Who would like to take that question? Kathleen?
Ask Diana.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. People who are living in another country, as I have myself, don't break their ties or lower their stakes in their country of origin necessarily. Some do, but they're unlikely to be motivated to vote in national elections, I suspect. So I think in a world of increasingly easy sort of communications and transportation and so on, people have both feet very firmly, can have feet very firmly planted in two countries, and have their own state, have high stakes in the future of that country. So in my view, it makes sense for them to be able to vote.
Diana, would you like to address that before we move on to the next question?
Just very briefly to say, especially for first generation Mexicans, it makes a lot of sense for us, for them to vote in the Mexican election. They keep very close ties with their communities and with their families back in Mexico. Actually, remittances are a very important source of resources for Mexico. So if they send remittances, they should also have a right to express their political views and their political preferences. So for us in Mexico, it does make a lot of sense, not only in terms of the importance of remittances, but also because our diaspora, especially to North America, keeps a very close relation, very close ties with their families in Mexico. So whatever happens in Mexico is relevant for them through their families, but also directly for the services that the Mexican government provides to them when they are living abroad. Consular services, embassy, and so on. So for us, yes, it is very important.
Okay, a question for Dr. Chopra and Dr. Panagariya. Modi's government is suspected of suppressing opposition in diaspora countries. How vulnerable do diaspora folks feel about expressing opposition to Modi? Dr. Chopra, would you like to take that on first, and then I'll move to you, Dr. Panagariya?
Sure, I think it is. I think it's a justified. It's a justified fear. There is a sort of well-funded and a very effective global network of Hindu right-wing organizations. I was part of a conference on Hindu nationalism, which was supported by 2 years ago, supported by about 50 American universities and 100 centers. That received 100,000 emails in protest. The speakers received threats, death threats, women and religious minorities. And far-right Hindu organizations in the US, like the Hindu American Foundation, the Coalition of Hindus North America, spearheaded some of that attack, though they, paid the usual lip service in denying violence. They have also filed cases against academics. They have sought to shut academic critics. Unfortunately, I was at an incident on the CA-NRC, which is, it's to do with Citizen Amendmentship Act and a National Register of Citizens. It's been passed, but it's not been implemented. And there were members of the diaspora who, technically it was felony assault, rushed up to the stage when I was speaking, yelled other speakers down. So this is a real fear. And one of the problems with the diaspora, there's another question someone asked about the impact of the diaspora on democracy in general. And I think I will end with this comment and turn it over to Dr. Panagariya. One of the problems with the good section or a good component of the Indian American population, particularly the Hindu American population, is a phenomenon of what are called Modi Democrats. In the US, you want equal rights, you want minority rights, you want freedom of expression, freedom of religion, but the same communities campaign very actively for India to be a de facto Hindu state, where you want to deny minorities the same rights in India that you as a minority want in America. And I think this is a sort of enormously distressing development. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Dr. Panagariya, I think you might have something to say about that.
Well, look, I mean, I have to give you the disclosure. I worked actually for the Modi government for 3 years. And, these threats and counter threats are both ways. And what does Modi government have to do with it? This is happening within the US largely, and these are individuals. So there are very strong left of center organizations as well in the US, funded by Soros and many others, equally well funded, better funded actually, who engage as well. So I just don't see what does that have to do with the Modi government. We never endorsed any of this when in the government, and certainly during the 3 years I was there. So Indians are very argumentative and they argue, but it's both ways.
All right, Rong, a question for you. How much did the collapse of the democracy movement in Hong Kong affect diaspora Chinese views about Taiwan?
I actually think it make the support of democracy and support of Taiwan stronger among the diaspora Chinese. And I think since the crackdown in Hong Kong, I see more protests here on the street of the US in supporting Taiwan. But not only supporting Taiwan, but also supporting Hong Kong and the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, all of them like coming together to protest and to send out their voices. And also, I think the crackdown make this kind of voices, it offered them more international audience, a greater international audience. Before the Hong Kong crackdown, there were some protests like that too, but rarely they hit the headlines. But now I think I see, especially the mainstream media, cover this protests more and more often. So I think on the international stage, it's actually helped the people, pro-democracy people.
Thank you. Arceli Martinez has a question for Diana. Arceli, could you please ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Sunita, and Happy New Year. I would like to ask her, what would be the message for Mexicans in the US to register to vote, to encourage them to vote? And what is important that we had that opportunity? And how many Mexicans abroad are expected to vote in Mexican election this year?
So far, and this figure may be updated already, but at this point, we have around 70,000 people registered to vote from abroad. Very few, and as you can tell, it is something that we need to increase. The number of people who can vote from other countries. And the second question, which is very important, is I would answer with two issues. There are two reasons why it is important for Mexicans to vote abroad. First, because this is an important election in Mexico for the number of positions that are up to vote, but also for what is at stake. In this election this year, we get to decide whether we want a continuation of the policies that we have had in these past 5 years and a half now, or we want to go back to the kind of policies that we had in the past. So it's a very important political moment in Mexico right now, one where Mexicans need to make an important choice that will have consequences for the future. The second reason is because we need better services and a better approach to the Mexican community living abroad. All Mexicans know that we need to improve the services that we provide through our consulates, through our services abroad. And this is only possible if we participate and we get our voices to be heard. So I would say there are at least these two very important reasons why we need Mexicans abroad to cast their vote this year.
Thank you so much. We have many more questions in the chat, but we need to end. I would like to end with a final question for all speakers. We are in a time of anti-immigrant feelings here in the US. How does the image of being dual citizens impact that sentiment? Dr. Panagariya, can we start with you?
Well, you know, this is not very new. I think this sort of sense in different ways has prevailed, has existed, and one can understand, you know, that if you know, when the change is gradual, you can absorb it, so the US certainly has had I mean, it's a country of immigrants, but the flow had been a little bit slow, controlled, regulated. I think the current pressures have come more from a very strong acceleration of the incoming immigrant population. So as someone who migrated to the United States 50 years ago, I sort of have a very long memory of this. And I think in the end, we are all very capable of dealing with these pressures. And just as we have done it over the last, not just decades, but centuries now, I think, you know, this will also pass.
Thank you. Rong, would you care to take on that question?
Yeah, China actually doesn't allow dual citizenship, but for Asians, we all know that whatever citizenship you are, even if you are an American citizen, you're still like always be considered as an alien. This is through the history to now. Nothing has changed. But another thing interesting I want to mention is the U.S. indeed doesn't allow dual citizenship officially either, but the U.S. just doesn't really care. So there's no enforcement. But if Trump is elected this year, I don't know what, you know, we'll see what he's going to do to this dual citizenship issue.
Absolutely. Diana, would you like to take the question on next?
I'm sorry, I thought it was specific to India. What is the question again? I'm sorry.
No, the question is general, as we are facing a time of huge anti-immigrant sentiment here in the US. What does the image of being a dual citizen, how does that impact?
Yeah, in Mexico, we do, in Mexico and the US, we do allow for dual citizenship for Mexicans. So that is a possibility. And having a better organization of our diasporas, I think that is going to be very, very important to make sure that we can change the conversation in the United States. I know that there is a politically motivated discourse, very anti-immigrant, but we need to recognize, and I think that US citizens need to recognize the very important contributions of the different diasporas in that country. You cannot explain that the dynamism, the place where the United States is right now, economically, socially, culturally, and so on, without their diasporas. This is a country that was built from the immigrations from from how many countries in the world. And the contribution of Mexicans, of Indians, of Canadians, of Chinese, Taiwanese, etc., to the economy of the United States, to gastronomy, to the culture, to the society is enormous. And I think that there is a need, all of us diasporas together, to make sure that there is a change in perspective, that we are able to recognize that the US society is able to recognize the important contributions of the various diasporas living in that country.
Thank you. Kathleen and Dr. Chopra, I'd like to ask you both a different question. Kathleen, in several countries around the world, women have just recently been given the right to vote. Is there a gender imbalance globally as to participation, voter participation?
There is. I mean, it obviously varies tremendously from country to country, depending on the status of women overall, but particularly in countries where women's mobility, where their ability to move around independently is restricted. It's difficult for them to register to vote. It's difficult for them to get to a polling place. And it may even be difficult for them to get information about their right to vote. So yes, there is a gender gap under those circumstances. In countries where voting systems are more established and more advanced, it's not such a big issue.
Thank you. Dr. Chopra, final question for you. Could you identify some of the primary social media channels used for used to spread misinformation? And if you could, in 30 seconds, talk about how we can identify deep fakes, that would be hugely informative. Dr. Chopra, are you still here?
Yes, sorry.
Oh, no worries.
So, how do we identify deepfakes is, I think, it's a difficult sort of question to answer. There are some things you can see. You just see sort of deepfakes of or artificially generated images, for instance, of Disney going around, and immediately people will say that you look at the nature of the animation, you look at the background. So there are specific techniques. But I think the strategy there will really be a kind of media literacy and educational literacy campaign. And I think there needs to be some sort of basic agreement, some common ground between the big tech companies, between nonprofits that represent the people, as it were, and the governments that need to sit down and agree with this. Now, one of the problems there, and I'll move to the question of platforms, one of the problems there is very often the biggest culprits are the states themselves. Right. So, the head of the BJP IT cell, Amit Malviya, he's sort of called Amit Malware. He has been called out by Twitter and other and by other organizations really for spreading fake news. And then the BJP government went after Twitter and their MD had to be whisked out in the middle of the night. And 2 days after this happens, or a week after this happens, the government itself levels accusations against Twitter and Facebook for spreading fake news. So what happens when the most powerful sort of entity, as it were, the state, which has, in Weber's classical dictum, a kind of monopoly over the legitimate use of violence, physical or symbolic, is also the biggest sort of perpetrator, right? So that's going to be the challenge there. But I think the big tech companies, constrained as they are, and they are to some extent in cahoots in bed with whatever government they are in each home state, they will hopefully come up with something. As Eric Schmidt on his blog, Schmidt Futures is his new venture. He has a set of about 6 or 7 things. Very quickly, in India and Brazil, WhatsApp have continued to be major sources of disinformation in a way that they haven't in other parts of the world. Facebook is sort of almost a universal source of disinformation. Twitter, again, is tactically used to spread disinformation. Facebook apologized for its role in a genocide of anti-Rohingya violence in Myanmar and anti-Muslim riots in Sri Lanka. So I think these tend to be the prominent ones. Increasingly now we are seeing some stuff on Instagram also, and perhaps something on TikTok. I know that in India, the 2014 election was supposed to be the Facebook election, as it were, and perhaps the 2019 election was a WhatsApp election with fake news, and it'll remain to be seen if 2024 is going to be an AI election that cuts across different platforms.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers and to reporters for staying on for this discussion, this excellent discussion. We close today. See you next Friday.